When the human warship appeared at the edge of the Vayari Dominion fleet, the laughter of alien officers fell silent. No one expected a single vessel to arrive in the middle of hundreds, and yet there it was, drifting forward with calm, steady engines. As if it had no fear, the alien admirals whispered to one another, asking if this was some kind of decoy or trap. But the ship kept moving, and with every passing second the unease grew stronger. Aboard that vessel stood Captain Daniel Carter, watching. The stars shift across the screen, his crew silent behind him, waiting for his first word. The galaxy would one day remember this as the moment everything changed. But for now it was only silence and tension, and the weight of something far greater than battle. The bridge was quiet except for the hum of the core that pulsed through the ship like a heartbeat. Commander Olivia Barnes stood close by, her eyes fixed on the data streams. She trusted Daniel more than anyone alive, and when she reported that all systems were ready, her voice was firm without fear. Lieutenant Ethan Brooks manned the weapons, his hands steady on the console, though he checked the targeting arrays again and again. Every officer on board knew that this fight was not just about survival. It was about sending a message. Earth was young in the galaxy, but it was not weak. Daniel placed his hand on the arm of his chair and spoke softly to his crew, telling them they were not only guarding their world but showing the galaxy who humans truly were. Across the void, Admiral Karan of the Dominion leaned back in his command chair, his scaled features glowing in the light of the consoles. He stared at the lone human ship and laughed. The sound echoed through his bridge, and his officers joined him, their cruel voices filled with arrogance. They believed no single vessel could resist their fleet. Karan opened a channel, his tone heavy with mockery. He demanded surrender and told Daniel that Earth had no place among the stars, that humanity was nothing but reckless insects. Daniel listened with calm eyes, and when the Admiral finished, he replied with only a few steady words. He said, "Humans do not surrender. Not today. Not ever." Then the channel cut, and silence fell, the kind of silence that makes hearts pound harder than thunder. The Vayari fleet shifted forward, their weapons primed, scanners flooding with readings that dismissed the human vessel as weak. Yet in an instant their screens flared with alarms. The human warship powered its core, and the energy surged so high that consoles sparked, and engineers shouted in disbelief. Nothing that size should burn so brightly. Admiral Corrin froze, his laughter gone, as doubt took root. He told his fleet to hold position, but in his chest he felt unease. The numbers were still on his side, but numbers meant little. When the seed of fear began to spread, he saw it in the eyes of his officers, their arrogance fading, replaced by something colder. On the human bridge, Daniel looked at his crew and felt their silent questions. Olivia stood unshaken at his side. Ethan whispered that the guns were locked and ready. Daniel nodded, his voice low but steady as he told them. "Then let them see who we are." The ship held steady, surrounded by the enemy, yet not one alien dared to fire. Time stretched as if the universe itself waited. The standoff had begun, and though no shot had been fired already, the alien fleet felt something they had never felt before. Fear. No. Minutes dragged into hours, tension pressing on both sides. Daniel remained motionless on his chair, his eyes locked on the endless stars. Olivia continued to feed him reports, her voice calm, though her heart raced. Ethan checked and rechecked his targeting screens and whispered under his breath each time that everything was ready. The younger crew in the lower decks tried to mask their fear with nervous smiles and quick jokes, but everyone knew the truth. They were facing a force that outnumbered them hundreds to one, and yet still they stood unbroken. Daniel reminded them quietly that fear was the weapon of the Dominion, and they must not allow it to pierce their hearts. He told them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. His words spread across the crew like fire, and the hum of the ship grew steadier, as if the vessel itself believed him. Corrin paced on his bridge, frustration gnawing at his pride. He had expected the human to beg for mercy or to lash out recklessly. Instead, Carter sat calm and unflinching. The energy readings still pulsed on their scanners, each one more terrifying than the last. One officer dared to whisper that perhaps the human ship was more than it appeared. Corrin silenced him with a glare, but in his mind the same thought clawed its way forward. What if the humans had unlocked something that the Dominion did not understand? What if their science had leapt ahead in shadows, while the Dominion mocked them? The thought made his claws shake, and he slammed them against the console in anger. Hours stretched further. The human crew settled into a rhythm. Meals were passed in silence. Consoles updated with steady streams of data. The officers rotated shifts, so no one faltered. Daniel walked the bridge in slow, measured steps, speaking to his crew in quiet tones. Olivia stayed at his side, offering him the assurance of loyalty that never wavered. Ethan finally allowed himself a brief laugh when a junior officer admitted that his hands had been shaking since the first sight of the fleet. Daniel smiled at the honesty and told them all that fear was natural, but surrender was not. He reminded them again and again that the galaxy must see their resolve, that their silence and their stillness was louder than any weapon. Meanwhile, on distant council worlds, reports began to spread, whispers carried by scouts and spies of the lone human ship that stood against the Dominion fleet. Some dismissed it as a lie. Others argued no one could fabricate the readings that came from Dominion channels themselves. Ambassadors debated in crowded halls as they replayed the recorded words of Daniel Carter. "Humans do not surrender, not today, not ever," the phrase echoed. Across star systems carried in the voices of those who had long dismissed Earth, and now began to wonder if perhaps humanity was not as weak as once thought. Admiral Corrin could not sleep, his mind tormented by the steady glow of the human vessel. Every attempt to rally his fleet failed. His captains questioned him with their eyes, their claws twitching with hesitation. He finally gave an order for the fleet to prepare a test strike to end the stalemate. But when the command spread through, the ship's silence answered. No officer moved, no gunner obeyed. The fear had spread too deep. It wrapped around their throats and bound their hands. Even Corrin himself felt the weight of it pressing into his chest. His pride shrieked, but his spirit wavered. Daniel sensed the hesitation on the other side. He leaned forward and spoke to his crew in a low voice that carried the gravity of destiny. He told them that history would not remember the size of the fleets or the count of the cannons. It would remember the will of those who refused to bend. He looked at each of them, Olivia with her unwavering eyes, Ethan with his steady hands, the young officers with faces pale, but hearts burning. He told them they were the edge of the blade that cut through fear, and their silence would speak across the stars for generations to come. The crew straightened their backs, their breaths deepened, and their fear gave way to steel. The Dominion ships drifted closer, but still no fire came. Their weapons glowed with power, but their gunners dared not release it. Corrin roared with rage, demanding they act, but their claws trembled too much. His officers exchanged glances that carried both shame and terror. They had never feared another race before, and yet here they were, frozen not by weapons, but by will, Daniel Carter's will, and the unbroken spirit of his crew. In that moment, the warship seemed larger than any dreadnought, brighter than any star, the beacon of defiance in the endless night. When the standoff stretched longer, the alien officers began to shift uneasily in their seats because no one had expected the human vessel to simply wait with calm engines and silent guns. The Dominion ships were built for intimidation and swift destruction. Yet here they faced a ship that looked small compared to their war hulks, and still no one moved to fire. Admiral Corrin tapped his clawed fingers on the armrest of his command chair, his eyes fixed on the lone warship as if staring would force it to break. He could feel the weight of silence pressing down on his bridge, and it was a silence that cut deeper than the roar of weapons. He told himself that this was nothing more than a psychological trick, but the longer the humans held their position, the more his own fleet began to feel fragile. On the human vessel, Daniel Carter remained seated, his posture calm, though inside his chest the fire of determination burned. He knew his ship was outnumbered and outgunned, yet that was never the point. Earth had not sent him to win through numbers. Earth had sent him to show that even one human ship could stand unbroken before the might of an empire. He glanced at Olivia, who returned a steady nod. Her presence was a pillar of strength. Ethan's hands rested firm on the console, though sweat lined his brow. He whispered that all weapons remained locked and every missile stood ready. Daniel told him to breathe and hold for the right moment, because patience itself was a weapon, and sometimes fear spread faster than fire. The Dominion fleet began scanning the human warship again. systems digging deeper into its hull, searching for weaknesses. They expected frail armor and limited firepower, but the readings only returned more confusion. The energy signatures inside the human ship pulsed at levels beyond anything the Dominion engineers understood. It was not only strange, it was terrifying, because the numbers spoke of a core that should not even exist. Admiral Corrins, chief engineer, leaned close and whispered that the human vessel was burning energy, as if it were 10 ships in one. Corrins snarled at him to remain silent, but his claws scraped the armrest, betraying his own unease. He knew the eyes of every officer were on him, waiting to see if he would still laugh or if he would order retreat. Daniel finally stood from his chair. The crew rose with him, every pair of human eyes fixed forward. He walked slowly to the center of the bridge and looked at the star. Map: the Dominion fleet surrounded them in every direction. Yet he did not see cages or walls. He saw only a challenge, and challenges were what humans had always lived through. His voice rang across the bridge, quiet but unshaking, when he said that history was being written in this moment and that their families back on Earth would one day speak of them with pride. His crew straightened their backs as if his words had burned away their fear and filled them with iron. Across the Dominion flagship, Corrin rose as well, his voice echoing as he demanded again that the humans surrender or face destruction. But there was less power in his words now. They felt like an echo of something once strong, now hollow. Daniel's response was simple. He said, "If you believe you can destroy us, then fire and let the galaxy watch who trembles first." Then he cut the channel again, leaving only silence and the heavy breath of doubt behind. Minutes stretched like hours. The Vayari Dominion fleet held weapons, primed, but no ship fired. Corrin's second-in-command whispered that hesitation was dangerous and that the humans were baiting them. Yet no one moved to press the trigger because deep down, none of them wished to be the one remembered as the fool who tested the unknown. The stories of Deathworlders had spread across the galaxy, though most dismissed them as exaggerated myths, but now standing before a ship that should have fled, yet did not, the myths no longer seemed so far away. Inside the human warship, Olivia reported that the enemy weapons were locked but still not firing. Daniel told her to prepare the countermeasures and keep engines ready for sudden maneuvers. Ethan asked if they should open fire first to show their strength. Daniel shook his head and reminded him that sometimes the greatest strike was the one never used at all. He wanted the Dominion to destroy itself with fear and doubt, because that victory would echo far louder than a volley of missiles on distant stations across the galaxy. Other species watched the standoff through intercepted transmissions. Some laughed at first, mocking the humans for their arrogance, but as the minutes passed and the Dominion failed to act, those same voices began to fall. Silent whispers turned to questions, and questions to unease. If a single human warship could freeze an entire Dominion fleet, what would happen when Earth sent 10 or 20? What would happen when humans stood not in the shadows, but at the center of galactic power? The thought itself spread like wildfire, reaching even those who had once ignored humanity. Back on the Dominion flagship, Admiral Corrin finally slammed his fist against the console. Sparks leapt from the strike and his crew flinched. He could not stand the weight of hesitation any longer. He ordered one of his forward ships to test the human vessel with a single barrage. The order echoed through the fleet, but even then hesitation clung to the officers until finally one captain obeyed. A flash of light streaked across the void and slammed against the human ship. Shields rippled, but did not falter. The warship held steady, as if the attack was nothing more than a stone against steel. Then Daniel gave the order to respond. Not with full power, but with a single precise strike. A lance of energy cut through space, and in one blinding instant, the Dominion ship that had fired was gone, erased without even a cry of warning. The Dominion fleet gasped in disbelief. The human warship remained steady as if nothing had changed, but every alien officer now stared at their admiral with wide, fearful eyes. Corrin himself felt the cold of dread crawl across his skin. He had seen ships destroyed before, but never so clean. Never so final. The human vessel had not only withstood their strike, it had replied with something beyond comprehension. The fleet that once laughed at Earth now felt as though they were staring into the jaws of a predator they never knew existed. Daniel stood silent, watching the aftermath. His crew also silent, but in their eyes burned a fire brighter than any weapon they had shown the galaxy that humans were not prey and not weak. They were something far more dangerous. They were survivors who turned fear itself into a weapon. The standoff was no longer about numbers, it was about will. And in that contest, the Dominion had already lost. The Dominion fleet did not move after the first strike. The destruction of one of their ships echoed through every vessel. Like a silent scream, officers whispered to one another, their voices breaking through the still air, yet no one dared to say. The truth aloud, they all felt it, the weight of fear pressing down like chains. Admiral Corrin stood at the center of the storm, his claws digging into the console, his throat tight with rage, but also with doubt. He had mocked the humans moments ago, but now the laughter in his memory felt like an old foolish shadow. He wanted to command his fleet to fire again, but something inside him held back, the same something that held back every captain under his command, because they had seen power that did not belong to any normal fleet. They had seen certainty in the eyes of the humans, and certainty could break empires. On the human bridge, Daniel Carter breathed slowly, his voice calm, as he told his crew that they had done enough to mark this moment forever. Olivia reported that enemy formations were breaking slightly, their lines no longer perfect and disciplined as before. Ethan whispered that all weapons were still locked and ready, but Daniel shook his head once again, telling them to wait. Patience was a fire in his blood, and he knew it burned stronger than panic. Every second that the Dominion hesitated was a victory louder than the blast of guns. The galaxy was watching, and the story was already being written. Transmission. Relays carried the images across sectors. Traders, mercenaries, scouts, and hidden observers spread the news faster than light itself. Entire worlds turned their eyes toward the lonely human vessel and the mighty Dominion fleet that stood frozen like statues. Whispers grew in cantinas on backwater moons. Officials whispered in their councils. Rivals of the Dominion leaned closer to their screens. Even those who had once thought Earth was nothing more than a primitive world now stared with wide eyes, wondering how such a young species could wield such courage. The humans had not fired wildly. They had struck once and with precision, and that restraint was more frightening than reckless destruction, because it showed control. It showed purpose. It showed a predator choosing when to reveal its claws. Admiral Corrin finally turned to his officers, his voice harsh as he ordered the fleet to press forward. His words echoed, but none moved. The silence was heavier than before. Some captains shifted in their seats, but their hands refused to press the triggers. One even dared to whisper back, asking if the admiral was sure if the humans truly were as weak as he claimed. Corrin's anger boiled, but beneath it he knew that fear had already spread. Like poison through his ranks, discipline could not erase it. Orders could not erase it. Even the threat of punishment could not erase it, because the fear came not from him, but from the unknown vessel that faced them, with calm engines and quiet defiance. Daniel stepped closer to the forward screen, his eyes on the massive formation that still surrounded them, his voice low but steady as he told his crew that this was the turning point. Humanity would not be remembered for retreating or for bending its knee. Humanity would be remembered for standing against a storm with nothing but willpower. Olivia's eyes glowed with fierce pride. She had followed Daniel through countless missions, but never had she felt the fire of history burn. This bright Ethan clenched his jaw. His fear melted into something else, something sharper. It was not just survival anymore. It was pride. It was fury at being called weak. It was the determination to prove to the galaxy that humans could never be broken in distant systems. Dominion governors received reports, their faces pale as they listened to the transmissions. Some tried to dismiss them, claiming it was fabricated propaganda, but even they could not deny the images spreading everywhere. One human ship against a fleet, and yet the fleet had faltered their power. No longer looked absolute rivals began to whisper that perhaps the Dominion was not invincible after all. Perhaps their long shadow could be broken. And in those whispers, hope began to grow where once there had only been fear. On the Dominion flagship, Corrin's second-in-command leaned close and spoke softly that the fleet morale was collapsing, and that if they pressed too hard, some captains might even refuse to obey. Corrin slammed his fist against the console and roared that no one disobeyed his orders. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the truth pressing heavy against him. The humans had turned his own fleet into a mirror of hesitation, each captain staring at the others, waiting for someone else to move. No one wanted to be the first. No one wanted to be remembered as the one who tested the wrath of a Death Worlder. Ship. Daniel turned away from the screen and addressed his crew with quiet certainty. He told them that they had already won not by destruction, but by planting fear deeper than any missile could reach. Humanity had shown that it could not be dismissed, not by arrogance, not by numbers, not by empires. Ethan asked if they would retreat, now to carry the story home, but Daniel shook his head, saying not yet, the lesson was not complete. The galaxy needed to see more than survival. They needed to see defiance. They needed to see that a human ship could look into the eyes of a fleet and not blink. Minutes stretched again, the Dominion ships drifting but not attacking. Then one smaller vessel began to pull back slowly, breaking formation. It was a small retreat, but it was enough to trigger the cracks in discipline others followed. Inch by inch, like a wall crumbling piece by piece, Corrin roared at them to return. But his words were dust in the wind. The human warship had not fired again, and yet it had forced the Dominion to retreat without lifting a single finger. Daniel watched, quietly, his lips pressed thin, not with triumph but with understanding. He knew this was only the beginning. The Dominion would never forgive the humiliation, but the story spreading through the stars would never be erased. On Earth, families looked up at the sky, unaware of the drama playing far above their heads, yet deep in the void. Their future was being rewritten forever. Humanity was no longer the shadow on the edge of galactic maps. They were a flame that refused to be extinguished. Daniel turned back to his crew and told them to hold position a little longer, because sometimes victory was not in the battle but in the silence that followed, when the enemy dared not move. The Dominion fleet continued to fracture, Corrin's pride breaking. With it, he snarled threats, swore vengeance, promised that humanity would burn. But his words rang hollow even to his own officers one by one. His ship shifted away, not in full retreat, but in hesitation enough to show weakness, enough to show doubt. Daniel finally ordered engines to flare. He told his crew to move forward through the heart of the formation slowly, deliberately, not as prey escaping, but as a predator walking freely through its rivals. The Dominion watched, frozen, as the human warship cut across their lines, unchallenged, every alien eye wide with disbelief. That single passage was more powerful than any battle. The sight of one human vessel moving calmly through the center of a fleet, without a single shot fired, became an image that would spread across the stars forever. It was no longer a standoff. It was a declaration humanity had stepped onto the galactic stage, and every empire would remember the day one small ship taught the galaxy to fear the fire of Earth. The human warship moved like a shadow across the Dominion fleet, its engines calm, its weapons quiet, and yet every alien eye followed it in silence, as if the stars themselves had paused. Admiral Corrin sat frozen in his command chair, his claws tight. Against the console, the humiliation burning deeper than fire. Never before had his fleet been held in such stillness by a single vessel, and never before had he felt the eyes of the galaxy watching. As they did now, he could already imagine the whispers that would spread like waves through every corner of known space. He could see the rivals who had once cowered before the Dominion now lifting their heads with hope, and he could taste the shame that twisted in his chest like a blade. But even worse than the shame was the fear. For the first time he felt the Dominion was no longer the hunter but prey, staring into eyes that did not look away. Daniel Carter stood at the center of his bridge, his voice calm as he told his crew to maintain their course, his heart steady. Though he knew the weight of what they carried was greater than any fleet, their single passage through the Dominion line would be remembered longer than any war. And he understood that restraint was more powerful than fire. He saw Olivia standing beside him, her hands steady, her gaze locked forward. She did not need to speak, for he could see the fire of belief in her eyes. Ethan kept his focus on the weapons console, though his hands no longer trembled. Instead, there was a strange pride, a quiet strength that made him whisper softly that history itself was watching. And Daniel simply nodded. Far away on Earth, the first transmissions began to arrive, unfiltered and raw, across military command centers. Officers stared in disbelief as the images played again and again, one human vessel against a wall of alien power. And yet the aliens did not strike civilians. In underground networks caught fragments of the broadcast whispers, spreading faster than officials could Contained people filled streets with confusion and fear, but also with awe. No one had ever seen humanity in this light before, not as a small world struggling to survive, but as a force that could look at giants and not bend governments, scrambled to understand what had happened. Some feared retaliation, others whispered about opportunity, but all of them knew that Earth had stepped onto a stage it could never leave. In the Dominion capital, the council chamber erupted with fury. Scaled governors and commanders shouted over one another, demanding to know how such a thing could be allowed. Some called for Admiral Corrin's execution. Others demanded the total extermination of Earth to erase the stain from their honor. Their voices shook the hall with rage, but beneath the anger, there was fear that none would admit they had built their empire on intimidation and certainty, and yet a single human ship had cracked the illusion. Every rival would now test their power. Every subject would now question their strength. The council had struck the platform with his staff and demanded silence, his voice sharp as he declared that humanity would pay with fire and ash. But in the stillness that followed, even he knew that words alone could not erase the image spreading across the stars. Daniel's ship continued its steady course, sensors flooding with signals from 100 alien eyes, recording, broadcasting, judging. He knew he had risked more than his life by walking this path. He had risked the fate of Earth itself. Yet he also knew that fear once planted could not be uprooted easily. He leaned closer to Olivia and whispered that the real battle would not be fought with guns but with memory. She nodded quietly, saying that the Dominion would never forget this day even if they tried to bury it. Ethan added in a low voice that the galaxy had seen something new, and once seen, it could never be unseen. Daniel felt the truth in those words settle into his bones, and he told his crew that whatever came next, they had already won something. No weapon could take away. Back on Dominion ships, whispers spread through lower decks. Soldiers looked at one another with wide eyes. Engineers questioned how such power could exist, and captains hesitated to meet the admiral's gaze. They had all seen the same thing. A single Death Worlder vessel moving with calm against an empire built on fear. And though they would not dare speak the thought aloud, it lingered in their minds. If one ship could do this, what would happen if more followed? The idea festered, spreading faster than orders, faster than threats, and faster than the admiral's rage. On Earth, young children sat in front of flickering screens watching the grainy images and asking their parents if that ship was truly human. Mothers and fathers struggled to answer, their hearts filled with both fear and pride. Some whispered prayers. Others clenched their fists and promised themselves they would never let their world be weak again. Universities began to study every frame. Engineers debated what hidden power the warship carried. Philosophers asked if this was the birth of something larger, if humanity had just announced itself as more than another species, and in every corner of Earth a fire began to grow. The Dominion Council gathered again in secrecy, their voices no longer just loud with anger, but trembling with doubt. One counselor argued that perhaps the humans should be studied before. Crushed, another snarled that weakness had no place and that hesitation would invite rebellion. They argued deep into the night, but none could agree, because each time they closed their eyes, they saw it again. The human ship, cutting across their fleet like a blade through water, and no matter how they tried to twist it, the image remained stronger than their excuses. Daniel finally gave the order for the ship to leave, the Dominion line engines bright against the dark as they pulled away. He told his crew to keep their eyes sharp because though they had earned a victory, it was also a beginning. The Dominion would strike again and harder. But he reminded them that courage was not in firepower alone. Courage was in standing when the universe expected you to fall. Olivia whispered that Earth would never be the same. Ethan said quietly that none of them would, and Daniel let the silence settle around them as stars drifted past their screen. Whispers turned into legends almost overnight. In hidden ports, smugglers toasted to the humans in distant colonies. Workers shared the story in hushed tones, and in rival empires, officials debated if perhaps they should reach out to Earth before the Dominion returned. Stories grew with every telling. Some said the human ship had destroyed 10 vessels. Others said it had faced the entire fleet alone. But the truth mattered less than the feeling it gave people. For the first time in generations, they felt that the Dominion could be challenged, and that seed of hope was more dangerous than any weapon. The Dominion Council sent new orders for fleets to gather, greater than ever before. But even as they prepared their war, they could not erase the hesitation in their own officers. Corin himself sat alone in his chamber, replaying the moment again and again, his pride shattered, his anger boiling but always beneath it. That gnawing doubt. He had told himself the humans were weak. He had told himself that numbers would crush them. But he had looked into the eyes of a captain who did not bend, and in that gaze he had felt something he could not name, something older and fiercer than fear. And so the stage was set. The human ship drifting home. The Dominion sharpening its claws. The galaxy holding its breath, waiting for what came next, and at the center of it all, one man, one crew, and one world carrying the weight of a future that no empire could have predicted. Daniel Carter sat in his chair watching the stars and whispered to himself that this was only the first step, because he knew the real war had not yet begun. The journey back from the Dominion lines felt longer than any mission Daniel Carter had ever taken. Though the ship moved smoothly through the dark, each heartbeat on the bridge carried the weight of what they had done. The crew remained quiet, not because of fear, but because they knew words could not capture the moment they had lived through. Olivia stood close, her arms folded, her eyes fixed on the shifting stars, her thoughts heavy with both relief and resolve. Ethan kept checking the weapon systems even though no alarm sounded. He was restless because he understood what the silence meant. The Dominion had not forgotten the humiliation, they had only delayed their response. Daniel sat still, his hands gripping the arm of his chair as he reminded himself that victory was never permanent, and that the true test would soon arrive. Across the Dominion worlds, the story spread faster than officials could contain it. Traders whispered in markets. Soldiers muttered in barracks. Slaves, chained in mines, lifted their heads and dared to imagine a different future. The image of a human vessel cutting across the Dominion fleet had become a spark in their hearts. Admiral Corin returned to the capital, his reputation broken, his words filled with rage, but his eyes carrying the weight of doubt. The council summoned him. Demanding answers, he tried to explain that it was only hesitation, that the humans had used tricks and false strength. But the counselors were not blind. They had seen the recordings, they had heard the silence of their own fleet. They accused him of weakness, and some demanded his removal. But he shouted that this was not the end, that he would return and crush Earth and burn the memory from the galaxy. His words filled the chamber with echoes, but even as they listened, no one believed as strongly as before. On Earth, the news struck like thunder. Governments scrambled to control the story, but it slipped through their fingers like sand. The people had seen enough to understand that humanity was no longer hidden in the shadows. Crowds filled cities waving flags, shouting that Earth had stood against an empire. Mothers held their children with pride, telling them that one day they too might walk among the stars. Schools filled with students asking questions about the Dominion and about Deathworlders. Engineers worked late into the night studying every scrap of data from the Warship to prepare for the storm that all of them knew was coming. Daniel's crew became symbols, their names whispered across networks, though most people had never seen their faces. They were already legends, and legends carried weight greater than steel. In rival empires, distant rulers gathered their spies and advisors. Some argued that the humans were reckless and would soon be crushed, but others leaned forward with interest, suggesting that an alliance could shift the balance of power. Whispers of secret envoys began to slip through the shadows, small signals reaching toward Earth with promises of support in exchange for friendship, for trade, for defense. Humanity had been ignored for so long, but now suddenly it stood at the center of every conversation, and Daniel knew that attention was as dangerous as any weapon. The Dominion Council gathered in a storm, their voices filled with fury. They declared that Earth would be made into an example. They ordered fleets to be assembled larger than before. Weapons older and darker pulled from vaults. Hidden and forgotten systems, they would erase not just the humans but the idea that anyone could stand against them. Admiral Corin begged for command to lead the strike himself. Though many called him a failure, his pride demanded vengeance, and the council granted him the chance because their own pride demanded it too. He left the chamber with fire in his chest, his claws digging into his palms, whispering that he would break humanity until nothing remained. On the human warship, Daniel met. With his crew in the quiet of the mess hall, he looked at them not as soldiers, but as people who had carried the weight of a galaxy. He told them the truth, that this was not the end but the beginning. He told them that the Dominion would come with more power than ever before, but he also told them that fear once planted would not die. Ethan clenched his fists, saying that he was ready no matter the cost. Olivia smiled faintly, saying that history would not forget them. Daniel felt their courage fill the room, and he knew that whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The galaxy held its breath, every broadcast, every whisper, every rumor painting the humans as fire against darkness in small colonies. Slaves whispered the word, human, as if it was a prayer in powerful empires. Rulers calculated if perhaps this new species could shift the balance of centuries in the Dominion cities. Officials tightened their grip, fearing rebellion as hope began to flicker among the people, and in the void fleets gathered for war greater than any seen in living memory. Daniel stood on the bridge again, his eyes steady as reports poured in of the Dominion preparing to strike. He did not flinch. He only told his crew that fear was their enemy, and that unity was their weapon. Olivia placed her hand on the console and said softly that no matter how dark the night, the stars still burned. Ethan added that they would make sure Earth became a name no one could ignore. Daniel nodded and whispered that the time was coming soon, and when it came, the galaxy would learn what it truly meant to face a Death Worlder. And so the stage tightened, the Dominion sharpening its claws, Earth preparing with fire, allies watching with careful eyes. And at the center of it all, a single ship and a single crew carrying the burden of a story that could not be undone. The silence of space was filled with waiting, and the stars themselves seemed to lean closer as if eager to see the storm that was about to break. The standoff dragged on like a storm that never broke, and both fleets sat in the void waiting for one side to make a mistake. The human warship still moved slowly, but its presence felt heavier with every passing moment. The alien fleet could not understand why one small vessel did not break or retreat. It was as if the humans had placed an unshakable wall before them. Daniel Carter remained calm on his chair, his crew breathing quietly in the silence. Olivia scanned the Dominion movements, again and again, her eyes narrowing each time as the readings returned without change. Ethan shifted only once, his fingers brushing the weapons console, but Daniel raised a hand to stop him. For this was not the time for fire. This was the time for something else. On the Dominion flagship, Admiral Corrin's claws tapped against the arm of his seat. He could feel the tension on his own bridge. The laughter was gone now, replaced with muttered doubts. His officers no longer spoke of victory, but of possibilities of hidden human allies or unknown weapons. One of them suggested destroying the human ship at once. But another snapped back, warning that perhaps this was exactly what the humans wanted. Corrin silenced them with a glare, but deep inside his own chest, doubt gnawed at him. He had studied many species, yet never had he seen one act with such reckless confidence. He wondered what kind of world shaped such beings, what kind of death world birthed humans, and what price it would cost to underestimate them. Back on the human vessel, Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady as he ordered a transmission sent to the Dominion fleet. The words were short and clear. He told them Earth would not kneel. He told them the stars belonged. To all who dared to reach them, he told them fear was not enough to break humanity. The message echoed across the enemy ships, and in every command center, alien eyes widened. They expected trembling pleas, not iron calm from a single captain. More whispers spread among the crews of the Dominion, and many began to wonder if perhaps their admiral had led them into a shadow far darker than they imagined. The warship's engines pulsed brighter, a slow thrum that grew stronger with every cycle. The humans did not fire, but the ship itself seemed alive, like a predator waiting in silence. Every movement made the Dominion vessels flinch. Scanners tried to map its systems, but the data returned twisted with impossibility. Energy readings far above what its size suggested. Admiral Corrin's jaw tightened. He barked at his engineers, demanding answers, but they could only shake their heads and stammer about power ratios that should not exist. The more they studied, the more fear took root, and the more the image of humanity shifted in their minds inside the human ship. Daniel turned to Olivia and Ethan, their faces pale but steady. He reminded them that their mission was not only survival, it was to carve a memory into the minds of the galaxy, a memory that would last long after this battle ended. Olivia nodded, her eyes like steel. Ethan grinned faintly. his fear turning into fire. They would hold, they would resist, and they would make the stars remember that humans were not prey but something far greater. The moment hung heavy in the void, and both sides knew that the next decision would shape the future of the galaxy forever.